everybody, Sage Apopum here again, founder of the School of Evolutionary Herbalism, and welcome back here to the sixth part of your series here, kind of laying the foundations for you of the evolutionary herbalism paradigm and kind of my approach to herbal medicine, which I feel like it's an important thing when you're kind of exploring options for your herbal education to kind of get to know a little bit your instructor and their approach and their way of thinking about things and approaching things to just make sure that it's a good match for you and what your interests are and what you want to learn on your plant path. So continuing on here, continuing on with what I was discussing with you in the last episode where I was working with the whole person and the importance of really having a model of understanding the human being in a way that allows you to see the relationships between the physical body, the emotional state, the psychological state, and even the spiritual side of life. Well, if we're going to have a holistic paradigm, we got to do that with plants too. And so in the same way that last week I was talking about kind of that core triune pattern in the alchemical tradition of sulfur, mercury, and salt, or soul, spirit, and body, so too does that same map apply to our understanding of plants. And so plants too have sulfur, mercury, and salt. The plants have a soul, a spirit, and a body. Or another way that I like to think of it is like they have consciousness, they have intelligence, and they have a form. They have a physical structure and form that is the vehicle through which that intelligence and that consciousness operates through. And to me, we have to approach plants in a holistic way, right? That we have to understand our remedies in terms of their wholeness. And this is one of the main things that helps keep us out of, what I refer to as the allopathic herbalism trap, right? I've talked about this a little bit over the last few weeks. But, this really strikes me because, when you go out onto the internet a lot of times and are wanting to learn about plants, a lot of the times they're really approached very allopathically. They're just really seen as, here's, what kind of diseases or symptoms that they're good for. And while that might be useful to an extent for someone that's a little more committed to their herbal path, that not just like the lay person, we have to know our plants beyond just what they're good for, right? We have to understand the core medicinal properties of those herbs so we really understand how they're functioning within the body. But from the evolutionary perspective, those physical properties are actually just the most fixed or material representation of a medicinal essence. In alchemy, they say that everything has an essence, everything has a quintessence, like a core essential nature. And in a medicinal plant, we say there's a core medicinal pattern within that plant. And that core medicinal pattern is affecting the salt level in a person, the physical body. It's affecting the mercury level, the psychological and emotional patterns, and it's affecting the sulfur level. And on that level of the soul and kind of healing those deeper traumas or helping to facilitate in our spiritual development and in our evolution in becoming a better version of ourselves, as I like to say. And so in this way, the spiritual property of a plant is the same pattern as the physical property and vice versa. They're not separate. In the same way that our soul is not necessarily separate from the body, so too are the spiritual properties of the plants not separate from their physical properties. The chemical property is the spiritual property, and the spiritual property is the chemical property, just reflected on a different scale. And so when it comes to looking at plants holistically, our goal as herbalists isn't to just know, oh, this herb's good for hyperthyroidism, or that herb's good for gas and bloating, or turmeric's good for inflammation. We have to go a little bit deeper than that if we're going to approach it in this context, and we're seeking that medicinal essence of the herb and striving to understand it in that context, because that's what allows us to see kind of, I guess, that translation between these layers of their medicinal properties and how they influence the layers of a person. So when we're thinking about the 3 philosophical principles in plants, kind of from this bigger picture perspective, we see the salt level is really the physical properties of the herb, right? We're looking at, this is the way in which that plant is influencing our body. We're seeing how is that plant affecting our organ systems, our tissues, our systems. How is it altering or adjusting the habitat of the body from more of like an ecological perspective, or what we might think of as herbal energetics. And so on the salt level of understanding a plant holistically, this is usually what I refer to as like the 5 keys of understanding an herb holistically. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on them, so I'm just going to give them to you real quick here. And I've got a lot of other videos going into significant more detail on these, but real quick, we have to understand the taste of the herb. We have to understand the affinities of the herb. Where in the body is it going, right? What organs, systems, and tissues does that herb travel to? From there, we want to look at the actions of the herb. So it's one thing to know an herb travels to the respiratory system, but once it gets there, what does it do, right? Is it expectorant and facilitates the coughing, or is it antispasmodic and relaxes tension and spasm? Is it demulcent and soothing and hydrating to the mucosal membranes? What is it doing when it gets to the parts of the body it has an affinity for? So I like to think affinity is, where does it go? And then the actions are, what does it do when it gets there? Fourth is the energetics. So energetics is a term that's oftentimes very much misunderstood. When we hear the word energetics or energy, we think of like, that's like the aura of the plant, or sometimes people think of it more as like a spiritual property of the plant. But really, energetics from a traditional perspective is looking at how is that herb altering or adjusting the ecological state of the body. And this is really based on, the way I see it, it's like weather patterns, like the overarching patterns in nature and how we describe our environment, how we describe seasons. I think that's kind of like why intuitively people tend to talk about the weather a lot. This is like this very deep way we, look at the world around us. So energetics are the herbs warming or cooling, right? How do they affect temperature? Are they moistening or drying? How do they affect moisture? And then are they kind of relaxing, or are they tonifying or tightening? So that's looking at the tension or the tone of the tissues. So that's really what I mean when I say herbal energetics, is how is that plant influencing the ecological status of the body. And that, coupled with actions, is a key way to really understand your herbs, because even just knowing an herb's action doesn't get you quite specific enough to apply it effectively. Knowing an herb is expectorant, it tells you something about the herb for sure, but it doesn't really give you a detailed understanding of how or when or what kind of person to give it to. Because you can look at your herbal expectorants and you can see lobelia right next to licorice, right next to osha. Well, all 3 are expectorants, but very different kinds of expectorants, right? Osha is hot and dry, licorice is moistening, and lobelia is very relaxing. And therefore you give them to a different kind of person with a different kind of cough, right? So the actions coupled with energetics is a key way of really understanding your plants holistically through the lens of this salt level or its physical properties. And then the 5th key is a principle in Ayurveda referred to as the prabhava, or the special potency, the uniqueness of the herb. In this category, I also sometimes like to put in what in traditional Western herbalism in North America is referred to as the specific indications. Like, what's the key pattern that you're looking for in a person that points you towards when this is going to be a really great remedy? So that can be a specific constellation of symptoms. It can be a certain pattern you're looking for on the tongue. It can also include what actually I would probably lump in the mercury or sulfur categories would be esoteric properties of the plants, which would be, maybe how it influences the emotional state or the psychological state, any teachings, kind of states of being that plant can imbue into you to help kind of further your spiritual development. And things like that. Even in like Ayurvedic medicine, they might refer to how a plant influences a certain chakra or things like that. So that is what I would refer to as the special potency. And I like that category because it says, okay, here's the main categories of how to learn an herb, how to understand an herb: taste, affinities, actions, energetics. And then here's a part of that framework that says, okay, well, here's the properties of the herb that kind of transcend that classification, right? Here's the part of the herb that can't be boxed in or put in a category, which I really, really appreciate. So these are some of the ways that we can understand an herb holistically from the salt level. Looking at the mercury level, this is really what I see as the psychological and emotional property of the plant. So how is that plant influencing the mind and influencing the emotional state? So we find that many herbs do impact us emotionally and psychologically. Some promote clarity, some calm the mind down, some help us feel more stimulated and awake. Some herbs can help kind of clear emotional states, right? Some herbs maybe work if we're in a grieving process. Some herbs work through, if we have a heartache, maybe life's being challenging to us and there's something heavy on our heart. These properties are very well known for many herbal medicines. And this is what I tend to think of as the mercury side of a medicinal plant. Now, these emotional and psychological states are in many traditions of medicine tied into organs functions, right? So, they say like in TCM, the lungs are where the emotion of grief tends to manifest. In the heart, we have joy, which people are like, joy? How can joy be pathological? Well, joy is like this, if someone's like giddy and laughing and kind of like overly excitable, especially in like an inappropriate situation, that could be seen as a issue around the heart. So many systems have psychological and emotional states connected to organ systems, and this is again where we see that bridge, that connection, that pattern between the physical and the more subtle layers of our being. So to me, I feel like it's very important to understand this virtue within a plant, and we'll talk about kind of my specific approach to that after we talk about the sulfur level of the plant, which is, as I said, to me, this is like the teachings that herb has. It is the way that herb helps us to heal those deeper parts of the self. I oftentimes refer to this as the transformational power of the plant, meaning how does that plant help us overcome those blockages or those recurring themes in our life that we just kind of have a hard time getting out of, the ruts we get ourselves into, the habits and patterns that limit us, that bind us, that keep us from moving forward in our life. And a lot of times those types of patterns are, not all the time, but sometimes they're due to trauma. Sometimes they're ancestral patterns or genetic even, things that are very deep within our being. And the plants have the capacity, especially when prepared alchemically, to heal those layers of the self. And that is what I refer to as the sulfur property of the herb, of being able to take our trauma and transform it, turn it into our gift, our strength, our medicine, our ability to do something positive with it, to learn the lessons that life presents us with so that we can integrate it and that we can move forward in a good way. And the way that I've come to understand the synergy of the sulfur, mercury, and salt within a plant is through what I call the energetic architecture of the herb. And this is based on the alchemical tradition, whereby we see that the macrocosm, the pattern of life, of nature, of the earth and cosmos, is the whole, is reflected within the part. And this is generally understood through patterns like the planets, the planetary bodies of our solar system, the elemental patterns of earth, water, air, fire, and ether, as well as these three principles of sulfur, mercury, and salt. So each herb has a core archetypal expression, that each herb has a certain planetary power, a certain elemental power, and a certain triune power, so to speak, that is dominant within that plant. It's like the constitution of the plant. And when we take a step back and we look at the physical properties, the mental, emotional properties, and the spiritual properties of an herb, oftentimes we can see that there's kind of a theme, right? That there's a theme here, like take nettles, for example. Well, nettles is a very strong Mars plant, right? Mars rules iron, and Mars rules the blood, and heat, and inflammation, and intensity, and Mars is like sharpness, and it's hot, and it's irritating. It draws blood. It rules the male reproductive system, et cetera, et cetera. It could go on and on. But nettles matches that planetary power very closely, right? It's sharp, it's prickly, it looks really intense. You touch nettles, you get this hot, red, burning, irritating skin kind of rash. You ingest it internally, and it builds the blood. Nettles is full of iron. Our blood is full of iron. Mars rules iron. Nettles builds the blood, but it also cleanses the blood. It cools down excess heat and inflammation and irritation in the tissues. So it cools down an excess of Mars within the tissues. The root of nettles is one of our best prostate tonics, right? It's amazing for things like benign prostatic hyperplasia and other prostate conditions. Well, Mars rules the prostate gland. And on a psychological, emotional level, nettles is very good for people that are, well, easily nettled, right? They're irritable, they're frustrated, they're hot-headed, they're intense. They need to kind of cool it down a little bit, right? So when we look at nettles and we look at all of its total global property, right? We look at its total global property, we see that nettles is like stamped with this archetypal influence of Mars very directly and very powerfully. And so we would say that Mars is sympathetic to nettles, or nettles is sympathetic to Mars. There's a similarity to them, which is based on the alchemical doctrine of sympathetic medicine, or the law of similars. And so through that, we see that this archetypal influence is reflecting the medicinal essence of the plant. And through that medicinal essence, we see that archetype affecting its sulfuric properties, its mercurial properties, and its salt properties as well. So hopefully that makes sense. This is like central to the alchemical approach to working with herbal medicine, and is really at the foundation of how I approach plants, and how I understand the properties of the plants, how I classify plants, how I prepare plants into medicines in the lab, and how I administer them to people. So this dynamic of looking at the interweaving of physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual properties of the plants is really brought together through that energetic architecture of the herb, or its planetary ruler, its elemental ruler, and in some situations, its triune ruler. And so to continue on with nettles real quick, well, we see that it's a very strong diuretic plant, right? We all know nettles makes you pee more, right? And it grows in very damp, moist habitats. Therefore, it has a very strong correlation to the water element, right? So the diuretic properties and all that damp stuff isn't really covered by Mars, right? So there's other attributes of the plant that are covered by these different archetypal rulers. So the water element, and then what else do we know about nettles? Well, it's super nutritive, right? It's full of minerals, it's full of amino acids, it's full of nutrients that help build up and strengthen the body and just provide bulk nutrition. So we would say it's governed by the salt principle, meaning that it is nutritive and building and strengthening to the body. We also see nettles has a little bit of astringency to it, some tightening and tonifying effects, which is also a salt correspondence. So then we would say the energetic architecture of nettles is Mars, water, and salt, right? And there's really fun ways that you can combine those virtues. And we would say, like the salt principle in alchemy is very similar to the fixed mode of astrology. So we would say it's like fixed water, which is the sign of Scorpio. Scorpio, interestingly enough, rules the reproductive system. And as we've seen, the root works on the reproductive system. It rules the bladder, which we've seen this herb is diuretic. And so it has this influence on the whole water economy of the system. And Scorpio is really intense. And let's face it, nettles is kind of an intense plant too. So I would say nettles is thereby, its architecture leads us to the archetype of Scorpio, which then branches off into some very interesting directions based on the Western mystery traditions and esoteric teachings of alchemy that really gets you deeper into understanding the core medicinal essence of that plant. So this is kind of some of my approach to how I think of plants holistically and looking at their salt, sulfur, and mercury properties. But how do we do that? Like how do you actually study a plant? And I think this is something that not a lot of people talk about, right? We just dig into studying them, but we don't take a step back and think, well, how should we approach studying a medicinal plant? And so I think there's a couple ways that I like to think of things to keep in mind when you're studying a plant. First is, traditional knowledge, right? I mean, we are so blessed in our modern world to have access to teachings from all across the world, ancient traditions that have been working with medicinal plants for a very, very long time. They know how to use their herbs. And I think this is a time where, keeping those traditions alive is very important. Learning from those traditions is very important, whether that's Eastern systems of medicine, Western systems, Northern or Southern. I feel like drawing upon traditional knowledge is very important in our approach to studying medicinal plants and integrating that into modern approaches, right? I think modern science does have a lot to offer our understanding of herbal medicine. I think more often than not, modern science really simply confirms what tradition has said. And I think modern science also does come up with or discover new properties of plants, new ways that we can apply plants. We have diseases now in our modern world that perhaps weren't discussed or experienced back in the days of older systems of medicine. So I think an integration of traditional and modern is a really good approach. And not that we need the science, right? I think you can study traditional systems of herbalism and probably practice very successfully, whether you know pharmacological mechanisms of action or what constituents are in the herb or not. But I think the reverse is not necessarily true. I don't personally think that one can really practice herbal medicine effectively, clinically, just based on modern science, or just based on knowing the chemical constituents in plants and their mechanisms of action. I think plants are too complicated to just be understood through that lens. So I personally feel that an integration of traditional and modern is a very good approach to learning medicinal plants. And the big one here is learning plants intellectually and experientially. I think it's all too common for people to approach studying herbal medicine just by reading about them in books, going to classes and workshops, or taking an online class, or watching a video, or whatever, which is great. Obviously, don't get me wrong. It's important to learn from other people, but don't let that override you having a direct experience with the herb. Because otherwise, it's just really comes down to raw memorization. And let's face it, most people aren't great at memorizing things. I know I'm not. But we remember what we experience, right? We remember an experience. We don't necessarily remember everything we heard or everything we read. So you can read about how bitter Oregon grape root is, but if you take some Oregon grape and you get that bitter flavor on your mouth, you will know forever that Oregon grape is bitter, right? And so to me, we have to learn them with our head and with our heart. And I think there's a reason why we have that saying in the English language, to learn something by heart. Well, what do we learn by heart? It's like something that's integrated. When we know it by heart, it's like embodied, it's grounded, it's solid. You don't forget things you know by heart very easily. You forget things you memorize really easily, right? That's like the way our whole educational system is set up, is like memorize the data and knowledge, spit it out on the test, get a good grade, and then walk out of the room and you forget like most of what you thought you knew, right? And so this is why, maybe not for everyone, but this is why I feel like we have to couple our study of medicinal plants with experience of medicinal plants. That means identifying them in the wild, right? Going out and finding the herbs that grow in your local ecosystem is huge. Local medicine for local people. If one thing COVID taught myself and my wife, it is that as herbalists, we need to know our local medicinal herbs. Because what will happen if you can't get an Amazon delivery of herbs to your front door? What happens if the shelves of your local health food store are devoid of herbs? What are we going to do? Well, we got to go out into nature and find those herbs out there. So identifying medicinal plants in your local area is a great way to build experience. I personally love just sitting with plants, observing them, looking at them through their entire life cycle, their leaving phase, their flowering phase, their fruiting and setting seed phase, their dying back phase. I learn a lot about plants just by observing them through their life cycle. And I love sitting with them and just kind of communicating and communing with them. You learn a lot by harvesting them. You learn a lot by growing them. You'll learn a lot by ingesting them. Like I said, taste the herbs. If you're studying an herb, you have to taste it. Whether it's an indicated herb for you or not, I think it's very important to taste the herbs that you work with and feel its medicinal effect within your body and play around with its dosage range, right? Try it in drop doses, try it in high doses if it's safe to do so, right? To really experience that medicinal effect of the plant, so that you know what to expect when you give it to someone else. And of course, administering herbs to other people is a great way to get experience when you get to the point where you feel ready to do that. And I also love experiencing herbs by making them into medicine. I'm a real big medicine maker. I have a pretty nice lab for making spagyric extracts of plants. I've been preparing herbal medicine for a really long time and really, really love that part. And I personally learn a lot about my plants through harvesting them and preparing them into medicine, taking that medicine and experiencing it in that way. To me, coupling that with reading about it and learning from other teachers and how it's used and looking up any research and relevant scientific information about the plant, wow, you got a really nice, well-rounded understanding of that herb that ultimately points you towards understanding its sulfur, mercury, and salt properties, which then leads you to understanding its archetypal associations, which really puts you on the path to understanding that plant holistically, knowing how to administer it to someone holistically, knowing how to prepare it alchemically, and ultimately being able to practice according to this paradigm of herbal medicine, evolutionary herbalism, which again is all about, facilitating in that physical healing and rejuvenation, that psychological clarity, that uplifted feeling in the heart, and that sense of purpose and path and healing the trauma and helping us to just live in accordance with the truth of who we are and our essence and our own true nature. That to me is so much about what I'm all about and what I strive to share here at the School of Evolutionary Herbalism. So the goal is the total global pattern of the plant. Everything about the plant is communication. Everything about a plant is a language. It just doesn't always use words the way we humans use words, but the plants still speak. The plants still have a language. We need to only develop the eyes and the ears and the heart and the perception to see it and to understand it and to incorporate it into our understanding of our medicine. So hopefully that gives you some insights into kind of my approach to plants and how I think about plants in the evolutionary herbalism paradigm. Hopefully that's inspiring to you and kind of gives you a little bit of a sense for how to approach your herbal studies. You know, to me, it's like, again, thinking about how to study an herb. And hopefully this gives you some good tools to work with on your plant path. Thanks so much for joining me here in this session. I've got one more video for you in this little introduction to evolutionary herbalism series that we got going on here. So be sure to join me next week where I'm going to share with you about your plant path, like your plant path, and a way for you to kind of consider, you know, where you've been, where you are, and really what you need to do to move forward on your plant path, on your journey as an herbalist. I think sometimes it can be really easy to get a little overwhelmed or a little lost or a little confused or a little like, what do I need to learn? Like, what do I need to focus on? And sometimes it can be helpful to have some kind of cues and kind of step back and get a high level picture of your plant path so that you can get some clarity on what your next steps look like. So be sure to join me next week. We're going to talk about your plant path a little bit more, and got some great stuff lined up for you to help you get some clarity and just help you out on your herbalism journey. So thanks so much for joining me here. Hope you enjoyed this post, and until the next one, take care and be well.